The United States military right now is facing a huge problem, and that is the fact that most Americans do not really trust the institution of America's military. And this really has been to the ire, to the consternation, to the concern and despair of America's military recruiters, because they have been having such difficulty in persuading and convincing people to join the ranks of America's military. I know for a fact that they had difficulty trying to recruit me. I once had two U.S. Army recruiters approach me when I was in a mall, and they tried to convince me to join the United States military, and I gave them all the reasons as to why I don't want to join. And so many Americans feel the same. So many Americans have no interest in joining the United States military. They see no reason to, and they see no reason to really put in a lot of passionate confidence and patriotic zeal in the United States military. So there's a reason for this. There's a reason for this, and it has a lot to do with whistleblowers and all sorts of alternative media sites that talk about the evils of the United States military, how America arms terrorists and thugs and criminals. And we saw what happened in Afghanistan. They sent all these Americans to fight and die in Afghanistan, and look at what's happening now, right? Afghanistan is under the very enemy that they were sending Americans to go fight against. And the country that they send all these Americans to fight and die in, it's under the very enemy that they were telling us about after 9/11. And this is no longer the post 9/11 world. We're not living in the time after 9/11. We're not living in the early 2000s and prior to that, when people were very patriotic. And, you know, when Americans saw thousands of their fellow citizens slaughtered, not in a different country, but in New York City, so many Americans joined recruitment centers to join the United States military, to become members of the United States military, because they felt this passionate patriotism, they felt this zeal, they felt this sense of having to fight for their country because they saw their fellow countrymen getting killed. But we're not living in that time anymore. There was this huge, honeymoon season where everybody wanted to defend America, not everybody around the world, but everybody in the United States wanted to fight America, and they didn't give a damn if Iraq had nothing to do with it. You could have told the average American Iraq had nothing to do with it, and they wouldn't care. They would say it's all the same damn thing. They're all the same people. They're all Muslim fanatics. Let's just bomb them. I remember in those days watching stand-up comedy on Comedy Central, listening to comedians give jokes that were very patriotic. Jokes that you wouldn't even hear today. I remember hearing a comedian, I don't remember his name, but there was a lot of comedians in those days that we don't even remember anymore, that are no longer even famous. But I remember there was one comedian that said something like, now we're invading Iraq, but then there's another country in the Middle East called Iran, Iraq. What's the difference? The difference is only one letter. Just bomb both of them already. And everybody just laughed, and I was laughing. I mean, we all thought it was hilarious. But now we look back at that and we think, that's pretty damn cringe, right? Like, it sounds cringe. And if you were to make a joke like that today, people will just look at you like, what are you, some kind of moron? Don't you know what we did to Iraq? Don't you know that we destroyed that country? Don't you know that tons of people died over there because of this war that had no connection to 9/11, that was really just about advancing America's geopolitical imperial interest? And so many people think this way. A lot of people have been awakened to frankly speaking, the bullshit of American propaganda. Fighting for your country, war on terrorism. Yes, America was fighting terrorists. Yes, America was fighting and killing people who needed to be fought against and who needed to be taken out. But the fact is that America also armed terrorists. America has also trained terrorists. And America sent all these people to go fight and die in Afghanistan to fight against the Taliban, to get into battles with the freaking Taliban. And now who's ruling Afghanistan? It's the damn Taliban. So what is the point? It's like after World War II, America sent all these soldiers to fight and die to take out the Third Reich. The Third Reich was taken down, and what does America do after the war? Yeah, those Nazi scientists who are also mass murderers, let's work with them, let's hire them. So, but you see, back in the day, decades and decades and decades ago, people relied on the newspaper, right? You read the newspaper, and the newspaper gave you the news, and you got basically the official narrative. There was no democratization of the media. Everything was heavily guarded. Everything was heavily controlled. There was a ton of gatekeeping. The whole damn media apparatus in the United States, and really, everywhere else, because there was no internet, was gatekeeped. It was guarded by gatekeeping. You needed to be a special journalist with special credentials, with a special resume to even have your work published by newspapers back in the day, before the internet became this huge place of media. Now with the internet, now with social media, media is no longer gatekept. There's really no longer any gatekeeping. Now, some guy in his garage in Kenya can become a YouTuber. Some guy all the way down in Australia can become a YouTuber, can start a blog. Somebody all the way as far as Siberia can become a journalist. And you've never even seen this guy. Like, you don't even know who he is, but he writes anonymously and he puts his opinions out there, and maybe he's a whistleblower. Maybe he's got some inside knowledge. Maybe he has connections in some Russian intelligence agency, whatever. And you're reading his stuff and you're like, wow, this is some interesting information that I'm not seeing in my own country's newspapers, my own country's publications. Nowadays, we can get online and we can read newspapers, not just from America. We can read newspapers from Poland. We can read Czech publications, Bulgarian publications, Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian. We can go anywhere. And if Google doesn't want you to see it, hell, I'll just find an alternative search engine. I'll go to freaking Yandex, which is a Russian search engine. And if somehow they erase an article from the internet because somebody out there doesn't want it to be read, or the publishers doesn't want it to be read anymore because maybe it has some information that could be damaging to the regime, I can just go to Wayback Machine. I can go to archive.is. I can go to numerous archive websites, for example, archive.is, and I can find erased articles. You can find tons of articles on archive.is that you can't really find just by doing a simple Google search. And archive.is is owned by the Russians. It's a website based in Russia. So what are you going to do? And I can just go there. The democratization of the media is so strong, it's pretty much impossible to fully get rid of it. And now when America wants to do something, I can just go online and I can find alternative opinions. I can find all sorts of information on it. And it's not just coming from alternative websites. Alternative websites base a lot of their articles on stuff that's being published on the mainstream websites. And so you have mainstream websites, New York Times, maybe the Telegram or whatever, Telegraph or whatever, and you can find these you can find little tidbits of information and put things together that conclude that the official narrative is probably a bunch of bullshit. And so alternative websites will pick up on this, they'll publish it, and now you have varying opinions that contradict the establishment opinion. So it's very difficult to really ingrain the official narrative in people. It's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to have most of the society agree with an official narrative. So if America wants to do something in Ukraine, there's a whole bunch of articles online talking about far-right extremists in Ukraine who are being trained and armed by the CIA or by NATO. And people in America say, wait a second, who are we helping? Who are we supporting? Or a great example, Syria. Syria was a perfect example. When the Civil War first began, there was all this support for the Syrian revolution, all this support for the Syrian rebellion. How long did that support last? Maybe like a month. It did not take long for an army of bloggers, including myself, to get online and talk about how the United States is arming rebels, how the FSA is full of crazy Islamists who are murderers. It didn't take long for people like me to find a video of a Syrian rebel literally cannibalizing a Syrian soldier, ripping out his, I think it was his liver, and eating the damn thing raw. It didn't take that long for me to find out that all of a sudden there was an outbreak of Kuru in Syria. Kuru, for those of you who don't know, is a disease that you can only get if you commit cannibalism. If you eat human flesh, you can only get this disease. And I think it's a brain-eating virus. There's no cure for it. It's very horrific. You will die. But you can only get it if you eat human flesh. And I think specifically if you eat another man's brain. And this was a disease that existed amongst Aboriginals down in frickin' Australia. It ended because of missionaries who went there and told the natives to stop frickin' eating people. And we thought, okay, this disease is gone, it's extinct. All of a sudden, it popped up in Syria of all places. It didn't take that long for me to find this out and to show that this was evidence of cannibalism that was being done in Syria. Who was doing the cannibalism? The rebels, the people that we were told were the good guys. So this is really the reason why there's a tremendous amount of distrust. A lot of people will not mind fighting and dying for a righteous cause, right? Putting their life on the line for a righteous cause, right? Look at American cops. A lot of people have joined the United States police force. Why? Because in the United States police force, you can see the enemy. The enemy is clear, right? There's a guy with a gun. He's putting other people in danger. You take him out. It's a righteous move. Some guy with a gun goes into an apartment building or whatever and starts shooting. Cops go in. They kill the guy. The mission is simple. And the purpose of the mission is very clear. The legitimacy and the moral integrity of the mission is very clear. It's quite obvious that this is something that must be done to protect human life. Very clear, very obvious. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Fighting those guys, pretty straightforward, right? You don't have to question it because they attacked us. Bang it a bang it a bang, right there. Nazis, obviously evil. The enemy was clear. The evil nature, the evil character of the enemy was right in the open. But then you're talking about Iraq. Invading Iraq. Okay, terrorists are bad, no joke. But now we're going to train them? I remember talking to a guy who was a Navy SEAL. And this guy, he wasn't one of those fake Navy SEAls. Believe me, I researched him. He was a real Navy SEAL. There's a lot of people who claim that they're Navy SEALs and they're doing stolen valor, but this wasn't one of those guys. And he told me about how he fought in Iraq. And he told me about how he had to protect members of the Badr Army. The Badr Army is a Shiite terrorist paramilitary group. And he told me that he had to protect them. Well, they're a terrorist group, right? And they're a proxy for Iran, but at one point we were protecting them. FSA, they were our guys. It was full of terrorists. Muslim Brotherhood, terrorist organization, but they're also our guys too. CIA has been backing the Muslim Brotherhood for decades. You see all this sort of stuff, all this information, and it becomes quite obvious that the idea of putting your zeal and your passion and your ardor, your confidence, your trust in such an institution would be idealistic in a very delusional way. And it just would be a knee-jerk reaction, not rooted in awareness of what is really happening. There was an article that was published today by The Hill, and it's about how trust in the United States military right now is at an all-time high. We're talking most of America's population. This was a survey that was done by the Reagan Foundation, and it showed how more than half of those who were surveyed said that they really don't trust the U.S. military. So I want to read to you guys some excerpts from this article published by The Hill today. And it says, the Reagan Foundation said no other public institution in its surveys, has seen as sharp a decline in public trust than the military. Now, there is some distrust that is held by some people in the American population towards the Supreme Court. But this is coming from American liberals, right? Some American liberals who are upset that the Supreme Court is dominated by conservatives who effectively overthrew Roe v. Wade, giving the decision to the states as to whether or not they want to uphold Roe v. Wade. And so this has angered liberals, and some liberals are saying that they no longer trust, or they don't trust as much, the institution of the Supreme Court. But that distrust pales in comparison to the distrust that is being held towards the U.S. military. This article goes on to say, a Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote in an opinion piece last month that, quote, many Americans think the military is no longer an institution that runs on excellence, merit, and individual submission to a larger cause. So the idea of a larger cause, this connects back to what I said just now. The idea that the enemy is clear, that the goal is righteous and necessary, this is not really being held in the minds of most Americans. And they're saying here that there is a lack of a larger cause, right? This idea that we're fighting for a righteous cause. That was very much so alive after 9/11, right? Americans died. America was attacked. Clear situation, very obvious to see what happened. The enemy is now right in front of us. We need to go fight the enemy, right? That was the perception at the time. But that perception got greatly blurred by all of the weird maneuverings that was being done by the U.S. government, supporting the people that were really the very terrorists that they were claiming that we should fight in the war against terrorism. The current era is marked by fading trust in U.S. institutions, but confidence in one pillar has held up, the military. But now, even that is eroding. So out of all of the institutions that are in the United States, the one that has maintained the most trust from the American population has been the U.S. military. But this survey shows that even this trust is going down. There has been a great dearth in trust for America's army. The survey, conducted on behalf of the Reagan Foundation by Beacon Research, also asked Americans why their trust in the military had dropped. The leading answer was that military leadership has become over-politicized, with 62% agreeing with that view. So 62% of people said that the United States military is becoming overly politicized. And you're hearing this opinion from both liberals and conservatives. Conservatives say that there's too much wokeism, there's too much wokeness, woke ideology in the United States military. And liberals are saying that there's a lot of far-right people in the U.S. military. And both are right, by the way. Both of those views are true. In the United States military, there is a woke ideology, pro-Sodom, pro-trans ideology in the United States military, and this leads conservatives to really not have as much enthusiasm for the U.S. military. Because at this point, like, what are we fighting for, right? Are we fighting for what? The right for a man to put on a dress? Like, it doesn't really feel right. And then liberals say in the United States military, there are a lot of people who are skinheads, a lot of people who are far-right fanatics. And this is also true. There's a lot of crazy far-rightists in the U.S. military. I know this for a fact. It's very true. You have people who are like hardcore nationalists. They're involved in like some weird paramilitary stuff, and they'll go to the shooting range and talk about how they're going to fight the enemy. But they want serious training. They want training that goes beyond just the shooting range. So they join the National Guard. They join the U.S. Army. They want that training. And that's very dangerous. And the U.S. military knows about this stuff. And it looks like they're not really doing enough of a good job in cleaning these people out. It's very, very worrying. It's really worrying, to be honest with you. Now, to be frank, the article goes on to say that about 47% of Americans said the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan were reasons for eroding trust. Absolutely. Two pronouns, Afghanistan and Iraq. You sent all these Americans to fight and die in a country against the Taliban, and who rules that country right now? The Taliban. What's the point, right? What was the point of this war? You just had a bunch of Americans go in there, die. A bunch of civilians died. There were war crimes that were committed by members of the U.S. military. And in the end, none of that was made right. In the end, none of that was corrected. All these Americans fought and died there. Why didn't you allow for their deaths to be done for a good reason? Why did you allow them to die in vain? You allowed those people to die in vain. And how can you trust an institution that would send you to fight and die in a country against an enemy that institution will later negotiate with and allow to take control of the very country that you sent people to fight and die in? I think that if you have a patriotic zeal to join the military now, I would say that you're quite overly idealistic, and that's putting it nicely. I remember years ago, back in, I want to say 2014. This was in 2014. This was in the winter of 2014. I was in North Carolina, and there I met an African-American gentleman who was a very good guy, a very upstanding guy, patriotic, but moral and righteous. And he had a good character. And he told me that he was in, I want to say, the Marine Corps for about 15 years. It was either U.S. Army or U.S. Marine Corps. Pretty certain it was U.S. Marine Corps. 15 years, U.S. military. And he said, I remember having to go down to the Pentagon. And they told me that I had to accept Sodom. And some pimple-faced nerd with glasses came up to me, never shot a gun in his life, and told me that I needed to accept it. And I said, no, sir. No, sir, I don't meddle with the wicked. No, sir, I don't meddle with the devil. And I left. And he left the military. He was done with it. And this was an example of somebody who was tired of this over-politicization of the U.S. military. I remember, and there's a lot of weird things that happen in the military now that I'm talking about this. The military is a very, very weird place. For one thing, in the recent past, there was a report that came from the Pentagon about literally thousands of American soldiers who were raped. And I'm not talking about female soldiers. I mean American male soldiers getting raped by other soldiers. Do you want to join the military when you know it's a possibility that you could get gang raped, you could get drugged and raped? Like, no, nobody wants to take that risk. And I've heard some weird stories from the U.S. military. There was one guy I knew who was in the Army. He was a tank guy, a tank commander. I don't know what they call it. I don't know the exact title, but he rode in a tank, okay? Tank operator, I guess you could call him. And he said that he almost, that somebody shot at him and almost killed him. And he wasn't shot at by some guy in Iraq. He was shot at by another American soldier. Some other American soldier tried to murder him. And he said that he reported the issue. They did nothing about it. And he said, I'm done. I'm out. And he left the U.S. military. And he told me the U.S. military, no. I remember I remember back in the early 2000s when patriotism was at an all-time high. It was after 9/11. And I remember watching the film Black Hawk Down. Great movie, very well directed. Ridley Scott did an excellent job in this film. It's about the Battle of Mogadishu, in which U.S. soldiers went to Somalia to fight against General Hadid, and because he was an evil, tyrannical warlord. And I watched that film, and I thought it was such a good film. It is. I still think it's a great movie. And General Hadid was a POS, right? And I remember going to school, and we had a woodshop teacher. And I won't give his name, but he was a great guy. He was a good guy. He had a Bible on his desk. He was a stand-up guy, very nice, very eager to teach kids about woodworking, about carpentry. And I remember sitting in his classroom and asking him if he was in the U.S. military. Now, this guy was covered in very severe burns. His whole face was covered in burns. You can see all the way up to his ears. You can see just this skin, this flesh, just cooked around his ears and on his neck and around his face, and it was just horrible, horrible. And I asked him if he was in the military, and he looked at me and he was very serious with me, and he said, "Don't ever bring the military up when you're talking to me." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "The military will tell you anything to get you to join them." He said the military will lie to you. They will say that we'll pay for your education, and they won't after you go out and fight for them. And I said, "Were you in war?" And he said, "Yes, I was. I was in Vietnam." And he was very serious. He says, "Don't ever bring the military up. Don't mention the military in front of me. I hate the military." He was very angry, very upset. And I remember one time it was a Halloween day, and I had a friend who came to school dressed up as a soldier. And he had a little, he had a helmet on his head, and he had a U.S. Army uniform on, and, it was Halloween. And I remember the woodshop teacher looked at him and just shook his head like, "Oh, you idiot. Why?" And he was very angry at the U.S. military. And he didn't tell me this, but I'm assuming it's because he went to Vietnam, got burned severely, and then got mistreated somehow by the very institution that he put his life for. He risked his life for. And I remember when I was in high school, a freshman in high school, and there was a recruiter who approached me for the National Guard. And he said, "How old you are? How old are you, young man?" And I said, "Oh, I'm 14." He said, "Oh, you 14?" He said, "Well, you can join right now, so that by the time you turn 17, you can get yourself ready to join the U.S. National Guard, and they gonna pay for your education." And I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yes, sir. That's right, young man. They pay for your education." And I thought, wow, this is a great idea. And he gave me a little pamphlet and everything. And I remember that night, my father had to drive to San Francisco for a business meeting. This was back in the day when my father ran coffee carts. So my dad was going to meet up with somebody to discuss, I think it was the possibility of opening up a new coffee cart somewhere in the Bay Area. This is back in Northern California. And we were driving in San Francisco. I remember, a beautiful city. And you can see the city lights and everything. Kind of felt like you were in the Matrix, right? And I remember telling my dad, I said, "Dad, I think I'm going to join the National Guard." And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, I think I want to join the U.S. military." I said, "I talked to a recruiter, and he said that, by the time I turn 17, I can pretty much get ready to join the U.S. military right after I'm done with high school, and they're going to pay for my education." And my dad said, "Listen, I did not raise you all these years just so that you can get shot and killed by a 3-cent bullet. And for some politician to later approach me and say, 'Your son fought and died for his country.'" And that really hit me. And to this day, I remember that conversation. And it really affected me, actually. So it's very true. When you watch the film Saving Private Ryan, there's a scene after the Normandy Beach scene, which is, to me, it's one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the whole movie. It's when you see all these dead American soldiers on the beach, and they're just moving with the ebb and flow of the waves on the beach. And you see each soldier just dead, and some of them have these bags, and the strap for the bag is on the shoulder, and I remember, as a child, first seeing, not when I first saw the film back in the early 90s, I had no idea late 90s, I had no idea what the hell was going on, right? But then later on, I watched the film still at a very young age, and I had a better understanding as to what was happening. There was a war, they were fighting the Nazis, all these things. And I remember seeing the dead soldiers on the beach, and you see the bodies, and you see the strap for the bag on the shoulder, and all these things, and you think and I thought to myself, that soldier, he put that bag on his shoulder. He put the strap for that bag on his shoulder. He carried a meal with him, maybe. He brought his canteen over. He did these things thinking that he was going to use them. And he didn't. Maybe he had dinner with his parents before going off to war. He said goodbye to his mom. I thought about all these things. Like, those people had kids. Those people were siblings. Those people were sons. And you think with each death comes the shattering of a family. And that really, really crushed me at that age. And it still does, thinking about it. And every time somebody dies fighting in a war, that's a son that was lost, that's a father that was lost, that's a sibling that was lost, that's a friend that was lost. And it's heartbreaking. I interviewed a Serbian sniper recently. He's been fighting for the Russian side in Ukraine for years, I think going all the way back to 2015 in Donbass. His name is Dejan Bedic. There was a film that was done about him. I would recommend that you guys see it. It's called The Sniper's Story. It's a very well done documentary about Dejan Bedic. And in the end of the documentary, he says, with everybody that I have killed the son, I have killed the father. And he didn't really feel completely right about killing those people. There was something in him that irks his humanity. And so with every war, you have death. And if that war is not done for a righteous cause, then those deaths are in vain. And if dying in a war is done in vain, then do you really want to fight in that war? And are you really going to trust the very military that's trying to convince you to join its ranks? I remember a few years ago, I was in a mall and I was eating some pretzels and, just relaxing. And two men approached me and they said, "Hi, we're with the U.S. Army. Can we have a word with you?" And I said, "Sure." And they sat next to me and they started talking to me. And I knew exactly what they were about. I knew exactly why they were there. They were trying to persuade me to join the U.S. military. And I gave them all the arguments as to why I don't trust them. I said, "Well, what about all the rapes?" One of them was more honest than the other. One of them said, "Well, yeah, that was a problem, but, we kind of got rid of that." Oh, okay. And I said, "Well, what about supporting the enemy? What about helping Turkey? What about helping murderers, helping people who are of bad will?" I don't want to join that. I don't want to help Turkey. I don't want to help terrorists. I sure as hell don't want to help Ukrainian Nazis. If the death takes place in vain, then you really can't trust the very military that wants to recruit you. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.